right, wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us for tonight. The Woman in the Library, a murder mystery set in the Boston Public Library. Australian award-winning author Sulari Gentill is here to discuss her new mystery, The Woman in the Library, which just became a USA Today bestseller. The tranquility of the Boston Public Library's reading room is shattered by a woman's terrified scream. Security guards takes charge immediately, instructing everyone inside to stay put until the threat is identified and contained. While they wait for the all clear, 4 strangers who happen to sit at the same table pass the time in conversation and friendships are struck. Each has his or her own reason for being in the reading room that morning, and it just happens that one of them is the murderer. Award-winning author Sulari Gentill delivers a sharply thrilling read with The Woman in the Library, an unexpectedly twisty literary adventure that examines the complicated nature of friendship and shows us that words can be the most treacherous weapons of all. And so a little bit about Sulari. After setting out to study astrophysics, graduating in law, and then abandoning her legal career to write books, Sulari now grows French black truffles on her farm in the foothills of the snowy mountains of Australia. Her Roland Sinclair mysteries have won or have been shortlisted for the Davitt Award and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Those are big awards in Australia. And her standalone metafiction thriller, After She Wrote Him, won the Ned Kelly Award for Best Crime Novel in 2018. Her 10th Sinclair novel, A Testament of Character, was shortlisted for the Ned Kelly Best Crime Novel in 2021. So all 150 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Sulari for joining us here tonight. And Sulari, take a bow. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Well, welcome, Sulari. Thanks so much for doing this. You have quite an international audience. And I guess the first question I wanted to ask you is, what time is it there in Australia?
It's a very civilized 9 o'clock or just past 9 o'clock.
There we go.
In the morning.
So Sulari, first question for me, can you talk about well, first of all, I guess for those who haven't read the book, can you briefly describe the plot of the book, the premise?
Oh, well, it's an unusual book in that really it's a story within a story. Set into the pages of a correspondence. The book opens with a letter, and the letter is addressed, Dear Hannah. It's written by Leo, who is an aspirant novelist who is based in Boston. Hannah is a fairly successful, established writer who is living in Australia. And Leo is, in the beginning, everything that anyone could hope for from a correspondent and a friend. He is charming and he is enthusiastic about Hannah's work. He's very admiring. He's even willing to do research. But as the novel progresses and you see more of Leo's letters, I think the reader comes to realize that there may be something quite dark about Leo. The other facet of the novel is the story that Hannah herself is writing. And she's writing a book, which Leo is helping her research and advising her on, around a young writer called Winifred Kincaid. Her friends call her Freddie. Winifred is in Boston to write a very worthy first novel under the auspice of a very prestigious fellowship. And so she is in the reading room of the Boston Public Library doing what I like to call mind doodling. She's staring at the ceiling, looking at the people sharing the table around her, and basically just trying to find a story. And then a scream just rings out through the reading room and shatters the silence, and everybody stops everything they're doing because they know that something terrible has happened. But when the security guards come in and a search is conducted, there's nothing. It's like the scream came out of nowhere and disappeared into nowhere. But of course it didn't. But what it did do is it allowed the 4 people who were sitting at that table, Hannah and 3 others, to talk. And a friendship is founded, and they begin their journey of investigating where that scream came from and who might have murdered the woman in the library.
And Sulari, I have an unstable connection, but I'm sure everything's going to work out well. So, and Sulari, can you talk a little bit about the inspiration behind the book?
Yes, sure. I had been writing historical fiction beforehand and other books, and the Roland Sinclair series is set mainly in Australia in the 1930s, but it had been so warmly embraced by American readers that I wanted to bring Roland to America as a nod to my American readers, and I wanted to write a book that was set in the US. But of course, I hadn't been to the US in a lot of years at the time I was writing it, and I couldn't get there. And so one of the worst things you can do when you set a story in another city or someone else's home is to write it badly and to not have it read as authentically. So to that end, I enlisted the help of a friend of mine. So Dr. Larry Vincent is an American writer who I happened to meet at a Melbourne Writers Festival. And we'd become friends and we'd been exchanging letters for a while. And he happened to be in Boston researching his own book at the time. So I contacted him and asked Larry if he'd mind just feeding me a few facts and answering questions I had about the city, so that I could write a book set in Boston. But of course, and he of course agreed, because he is a very kind and generous man and a very collegiate. But of course, Larry is a much better researcher than I am. So not only would he answer my questions, he'd start sending me maps and menus, suggestions for where characters might eat, weather reports. Then he started taking photographs and footage of sidewalks so I'd know how the snow piled up on it in the winter. And then one day there was a murder a couple of blocks from where he was staying. And Larry thought, oh, Sulari's writing a murder mystery. It might be useful for her to know what crime scene tape and coroner's vans look like in the US. So he went down there after the body had been removed and he took footage of the crime scene. And he sent it to me. So I'm in Australia and I opened this email from Larry and there's a little file attached, and I opened that and it's a crime scene, an actual crime scene. And my husband, who happened to be standing behind me at the time, said, gee, I hope Larry's not killing people to send you research. And of course he wasn't. I'm 99% sure he wasn't. But it did strike me as a really interesting idea for a novel.
And Sulari, why use a public library as your murder setting, and why the Boston Public Library in particular?
Well, number of reasons. One, Larry had been working in the Boston Public Library, so he'd been talking to me about how beautiful it was. But I knew that this book was going to be a metafiction, that it was going to cross that line between reality and storytelling and break that sort of fourth wall between the writer and the reader. And so I thought that a library as a depository of stories, as the place where stories are housed and held, would be the perfect place to set the opening of a book that was about stories within stories.
Yeah, I have to say, I've probably read thousands of books over the years, and I don't recall ever really reading a metafiction book like this, like a story within a story, set in a library. The protagonists are authors. There's a correspondence back and forth between an aspiring author. There's mention of literary agents. It's quite the picture that you've painted. So one question that we ask almost every time we have a big author event like this is, are you a pantser or are you a plotter? And this is actually something that your characters discuss at the beginning of the book. But Sulari, which one are you? Can you define those terms for us and let us know which one you classify yourself as?
All right. So to define the terms, I think all writers exist on a spectrum. On one end are the extreme plotters, and they write outlines that are possibly longer than the book that they eventually write. They actually think about and plot and plan every single turning point and conversation. That's the extreme plotters. On the other end are the extreme pantsers, who just sit down and write, have no idea what's going to be in the next paragraph, let alone what's on the next page. And most writers exist somewhere in that spectrum. I exist on the extreme pantser end. I just sit down and write. So after that first mention by my husband that he hoped Larry wasn't killing people, I knew that this book could start with a letter and it would be addressed to Hannah. And I knew nothing else. I just sat down and started writing. I had no idea who would die. I had no idea if anyone would die. I didn't have any idea who would kill them. I just begin and allow the story to sort of come together more or less organically, as far as I'm aware.
So that's interesting. So I guess as a follow-up to that, did you write both storylines maybe I'm not using the right terminology, but I'm going to say storylines simultaneously, or did you write them sort of separately? It sounds like they might have been simultaneous, but that's interesting to me.
Yes, they were simultaneous. So it was I was very much in that zone of writing a chapter and then being brought back to reality by Leo, who was commenting on the chapter. But that's quite often how writers write. Some writers write the entire novel before they hand it over to anyone. But even if they do, the whole time that you are writing, you're being influenced by the outside world. You're talking to colleagues, you're talking to readers. And so they all sort of kind of impinge on the whole process. And what I wanted to depict in this book, or what I wanted to give readers an insight into, is how that works on the writer's mind, the kind of influences that happen, either intentionally or unintentionally, and also the kind of resistance that a writer has to build up to keep the story true to what she wants it to be, as opposed to what the world is demanding of her.
Sure. Now let's talk about this for lack of a better word, this psycho fan Leo. Okay. Now, I feel like every once in a while, and maybe I'm wrong here, every once in a while, I think he kind of makes an interesting point in his critiques of Hannah's work. And one of them involves the pandemic. Now, I don't know where you fall on this, but in the emails that Leo sends to Hannah, he points out that in the coming years, contemporary novelists will have to carefully choose whether to include the coronavirus pandemic or not. So where do you fall on that? What's your thinking when it comes to your own writing? Should you include COVID-19 or not?
Well, I suppose it depends on the story.
Sure.
But I kind of think that with a contemporary novel, if what you're writing is a contemporary novel, you can't leave it out. It's like writing a book set in 1945 and leaving out World War II because it's too difficult. The problem with the pandemic is that, one, there's a whole slew of readers who don't want to read about the pandemic. The other point is, though, that the pandemic tends to abduct a narrative. Once you introduce the pandemic, it's so big, the whole book becomes about the pandemic. So I can fully understand writers not wanting to deal with it, and they're wanting to just leave it out of their book. But you cannot set every book from now on in 2019. It's the problem. But we're writers, and our whole stock in this trade is to be creative with this. And I think if we put our minds to it, and I think writers will put their minds to it and find creative ways to nod to the pandemic and to what happened and how the world has changed since then without letting it be the entire story.
And Leo sort of has a James Patterson moment, I feel. And you obviously wrote this before James Patterson made his infamous remarks a few weeks ago. But I think he said something to the extent of, after being rejected 10 times, he said, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially it's difficult to be a white guy writing books nowadays. It's hard to get published. So I thought that was a little bit of a palm head to palm moment there. But one thing he did bring up about race that I think I kind of agree with is that, initially Hannah's characters really, we didn't know their races. We didn't really know. We kind of had clues, kind of, sort of, maybe kind of based on what they were wearing, but not really. So, what were your thoughts on that? That was an interesting critique that you had Leo make about Hannah's writing.
It's interesting. I have never in any of my writing, so I've written 15 books, really mentioned what color people are.
Interesting. Yeah.
So I tend to allow the reader to imagine who they want in the role, and I give you eye color and hair color maybe as a thumbnail, and height if it matters. Mm-hmm. But generally, I've sort of followed that rule in most of my writing. But what I've realized somewhere along the line is that if you don't mention it, people default to white. And I'm not, that is not a criticism. I don't necessarily think that's a racist criticism or racist issue, because I default to white as well, and I'm not. It's just, it seems to have come out of generations of Western literature in which all the characters, or at least the heroic characters, were white. And so perhaps that's the reasoning for it, but it's probably in our modern day and age, it's no longer appropriate. But what a writer is often faced with is how to have that conversation with readers without seeming like you're criticizing or accusing or berating them. And that's not what I want to do. I just want to have the conversation. So I thought it was a much more effective thing to just actually have readers think about what they might have thought, what they might have defaulted to, whether they thought the characters were white, black, or brown, and why. And what I wanted them to think about is that enough of a reason? Does someone living in Roxbury actually tell you what color their skin is? Or does the fact that someone wears a hoodie tell you what color their skin is? And if that's the case, why should it be? So that's the conversation. There isn't an answer to that conversation. It's just that an awareness actually helps. And if you are aware that certain things in literature are certainly triggering your imagination in certain directions, that awareness actually helps you move it in other directions as well.
So let's talk about the locked room mystery, because you have one of the characters, I think, use the phrase, you kind of turn that on its head, or maybe they referred to it as a reverse locked room mystery. I forget exactly what they called it, but when the four main characters in the murder mystery storyline, so when Freddie, Whit, Kane, and Marigold get coffee together for the first time, Freddie mentions that it was the start of her friendship with a killer. So their friendship binds them together, so you didn't have to keep them all locked in the library. And I guess the question is, do you have favorite authors that also turned a good mystery trope on its head, similar to what you did in this book?
I am an Agatha Christie fan. I grew up an Agatha Christie. And the thing that I admire most about her nowadays, I can often go back to an Agatha Christie that I read as a child and read it now and think and find problems with it, and find that the book wasn't as magical as I thought it was back then. But the thing is that regardless of how many other authors have taken those tropes or those things that she did first and made wonderful and better books as a result. She did it first. She was the first writer to have the narrator as the killer. So there is a wonderful genius about the novelty of what she did back in the 30s and the 40s, when crime fiction was in its very early days. So I think, yeah, she still has my undying admiration.
Good answer. Good answer. This is a fun question. So Cain becomes a suspect in Caroline's murder in part because of his first novel. Do you ever worry about something similar happening to you? What does your Google search results look like?
Oh, my Google search results. Yes, no, my Google search results are very suspicious indeed. And I often actually think the reverse. If I was to kill someone, I would argue I'm a crime writer. It's not suspicious at all. I often think that would be the best alibi in a way, if you actually did do something like that to claim that you're a writer. But that's happened quite recently, hasn't it? In America, someone sent me a news item about a crime writer who killed her husband.
It wouldn't surprise. Nothing in this country would surprise me at the moment, Sulari. I'll take your word for that one. Yeah, I am familiar with. There's a. I don't want to get too far off a track, but there's there was a documentary made into a mini series called The Staircase, where there was a famed author, a male author, who allegedly killed his wife. I think he was found guilty of it, if I'm not mistaken, and he is accused of killing previous wives as well. So we won't go down that path. But
well, look, I think the alibi for crime writers is that, you know, we're the least likely to kill people because we write about people coming to justice all the time. So in our world, very rarely do killers get away with it. So we're less likely to be inspired by that. Would be my argument, Your Honor, in front of the court. But,
well, speaking of Your Honor, you know, if you ever want, I don't know how the Australian jury system works, but if you're ever looking to get off a jury duty, I suspect saying that you're a crime writer could probably get you off. So that's good to know there.
in Australia, being a lawyer gets you off too.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so either side of the profession, crime writer, lawyer, criminal.
So in the chat, yes, there was a female author who literally wrote a book called How to Kill Your Husband. And she is currently in trouble with the law. She is in jail, accused of killing her husband. Oh, she was actually convicted of it. This was in Portland, Oregon. So thank you, Myra, yes. Jill and Jerry, for the information there.
I wonder whether she argued research.
There you go.
At the defense.
Oh boy. So let's go back to Leo and talk about the line between fandom and stalker. I guess we don't have to get too personal, but have you ever, I guess where's that line for you, Sulari? And have you ever had a stalker, and how do famous authors handle stalkers? I don't know how any of that works.
I haven't had a stalker as such. I have had over exuberant fans. And sometimes, you know, the thing is, when you write a book, you write the book and you send it out. A reader is letting you into their head for maybe 10 hours or whatever time it takes to read the novel. And so by the end of that, they feel like they know you a little bit. If they read all your books, so I've written 15, if at the end of 15 books, I've been in their head for a long time. I don't know it, but they feel like they really, really know me. So sometimes, not often, that leads to readers feeling like they have the prerogative to tell me how they really feel and instruct me on what they would like to see in the next book. And that's something that I try to handle with as much grace and understanding as possible, bearing in mind that I've been in their head for a long time. And however much they may seem a stranger to me, they feel like they have spent a lot of time with me, which is what's sort of broken down those walls a bit. So I haven't had the situation that we have with Leo, and certainly Larry is not one of those people at all. It seems to be the particular skill of a crime writer is we take acts of generosity and normal everyday offers to help and find something sinister in it, and that's just what we do in our work. It doesn't necessarily reflect the actual situation, but certainly with this book and with Larry, he fed into it in very much a similar way as Leo. I would send him pieces of the manuscript and ask him to comment on them. And especially when you're talking about little things about American language and how that's used and American custom, those actually probably came from Larry's letters to me. And I just put them straight into the book. So it was kind of a meta process, even writing it.
Interesting. So folks, we'll give 10 more minutes of conversation. Then we'll introduce our guest if he is willing to come on screen, and then we'll take some audience questions. So Sulari, so getting back to the storyline with the murder mystery and the four main characters there, I think at some point, sort of everyone is sort of a suspect, and there's incriminating evidence, kind of, and you even get some family members involved, and you've sort of really a lot of twists and turns and whatnot. At what point, and I think you have the right amount of twists and turns, but do you ever find yourself like saying, are these too many twists and turns? do you ever find the plot getting too convoluted or hard to follow? And boy, I hate the mysteries where at the end it just comes out of nowhere and there were no breadcrumbs whatsoever. I think you will do a good job of avoiding all that in this particular story. But how do you guard against too many twists and turns?
Well, because I'm a complete pantser, I'm not counting the twists and turns. So as each twist happens, to me, they have to make sense. They have to surprise me, but they also have to have some coherence so that I'm not disoriented within the book. So where twists and turns get too much, I suppose, is where you start to lose the reader, where they think, oh yeah, this is just another twist that they're throwing in for the heck of it. But because I write so that I experience the book at the same time as the reader, in a way. When a twist happens, it has to feel like it's the right place for me, otherwise it won't twist. And I suppose that's the way you guard against it. I mean, that's one of the benefits of being a pantser. You're always in the book at the same time as the reader, and so you experience the book at the very beginning in much the way a reader does, and that allows you to sanity check what you're writing. Because if you lose yourself, or if you get confused yourself, you're going to lose the reader very easily, and maybe you should take another turn.
Great. So taking a step back, or looking at it kind of from a bigger view here, we mentioned when I introed you, and you mentioned in your introductory remarks, that you also write the Roland Sinclair mystery series. And does it feel significantly different to write a standalone project like The Woman in the Library as opposed to an ongoing series like Roland Sinclair?
In a way, I think in the beginning, when you start writing, it's like writing the first book of a series. So you're not as conscious of the fact that this is a standalone. Where you become conscious of it is towards the end of the book, when you know you're going to have to say goodbye. So for me, as a writer, the reason I have been to date writing long series is because I clearly have issues saying goodbye to characters. And so I try and pull another book out of them. But After She Wrote Him and The Woman in the Library and there's another one coming up afterwards. They were always written as standalones because they wanted to say something in particular, and what I wanted to say was I could say in one book. Certainly with the series, it's a longer discussion. It's something that will take more than one book to say.
I don't know if I want to waste one of my last questions on this, but I'm going to do it. I noticed that the American version of the book, which has a wonderful book cover here, is different than I believe the Australian version. Am I right about that? I've seen a blue cover with a yes or turquoise there. Yeah. So why the difference? Australians like that and Americans like this? I mean, what's that about?
Well, covers and so on are determined by publishers primarily. Mm-hmm. I was really amused by this because clearly the Americans are playing on the literary metafiction aspects of the book, whilst the Australians seem to just think murder is fun. And it was, but both covers tap on an aspect of the book. So I think what the Australians were looking at is that whole Alfred Hitchcock lock room and sort of that light, funny, witty aspect of the book, whilst the Americans were looking at the postmodern, the new structure, the darker elements of the book, and the way it looks at society and the way it looks at writing and Leo, I suppose. In those veins, but I think both of them reflect the book in their own way. It just so happens that my Australian publishers decided to go for the murder is fun line.
And what was it like writing this book? And I believe you wrote at least another book, if not more, during the pandemic. You know, I imagine that must have been awfully difficult. And I know you relied on Larry a bit, but what was that like mentally? Was it a release for you to be able to still to work, or how did that go?
Well, I think because just immediately prior to the pandemic was the Australian bushfires. So I think that had a double effect. So Batlow is the little town in the mountains that was declared undefendable where I live. So we were absolutely smashed by the bushfires. And my husband and my son are both volunteer firefighters, so they were away doing that. And I was writing The Woman in the Library whilst in evacuation in what I call the refugee house, which was a house in the neighbouring town where 3 families had been stuffed. For me, it was an escape. I write to escape. I go into my head, and that's where I shut out the craziness of the world. So in that time when we thought we'd lost the house and I was worried about whether my husband and my son would come out of it alive, the only way for me to maintain my sanity was to go into my head and write. And The Woman in the Library really helped me with that. And then through the pandemic, I think I wrote 3 novels that year. And there was something about that mortal fear, that idea that it could all be over for all of us. I just wanted to write. I wanted to get all those stories that were inside my head out as quickly as possible. It wasn't even in the sense of a legacy. It was, I suppose, when you have limited time, you do what you think you're here to do. And it was that, the pandemic and the bushfires and that period of history and life. It was this feeling that everything could be ending. and my impulse and my drive at that time was just get these stories out and put them out into the world. Luckily, I was wrong. It isn't all ending. We're going to be, it's an interesting time in history, but I think we're going to work through it. But it was certainly a motivation and a sudden sense of energy to do this. And it's been handy. All those books really saved my sanity, I think, through the pandemic when you were just stuck at home doing things. But also to be fair, because of the bushfires, being stuck at home when just after you thought you'd lost your home was not a bad thing. So we went immediately from the bushfires. We came back and everything was black and the house was still standing, but everything else had been burnt. And the last thing I wanted to do was leave home. I just wanted to get in, start planting and digging and cleaning up and pulling up fences and, getting rid of the burnt rubbish. So I think in some ways I might have had an easier time with the pandemic than most people, simply because we sort of had a disaster before.
And I'll end this portion of the talk with this question. What advice would you give to aspiring authors who hope to successfully publish their works? It's interesting, we never actually got Hannah's responses to Leo. It was always the other way. It was always Leo to Hannah, not Hannah to Leo. So if you were Hannah, what would Hannah tell Leo? And in real life, IRL, what would Sulari tell aspiring writers? What advice would you have for them?
Okay. I would tell aspiring writers to find a way to love actual writing, to find a way to love the process of putting one word after another into sentences and putting one sentence after another into a story. Because this is a difficult life to choose, the life of a writer. It is unpredictable. And there is a lot about it that you can't control. You can't control awards. You can't control sales. You can try your best. You can write the best novel that you are capable of doing and put it out there and try to talk to as many people as you can. But ultimately, you can't control sales. You can't control how the book is received. You can't control reviews. But if you can control loving what you do, if you can get your joy from actually making the story, then you have something, and that will sustain you through the ups and downs. So that would be my advice. However you do it, try and find a way to love what you do rather than loving having written.
Wonderful, wonderful words. So now we'll take a few moments, and if he's available, Dr. Vincent, if you're available, feel free to unmute, and if you want to share your video, it's up to you. Oh, wonderful, excellent. So Dr. Vincent, why don't you introduce yourself to the group? We got about 150 people on the call, and explain your connection to Sulari.
Well, first, let me say, hi, Sulari. I've never found it harder to press a start video button in my entire life. I'd also like to preface things with saying that I view myself as the light Leo and not the dark Leo. And I see Leo strictly as someone who likes giving restaurant recommendations to fictional characters. So those are my qualifiers. I write under the name of L.M. Vincent. I started out years ago in the 70s and early 80s, wrote a couple mysteries myself. And I've written nonfiction and fiction since. The book I was working on at the time was a book called Theft of Privilege, which is about a secret society at Harvard. Quite academic and arcane, but that was why I was in the Boston Public Library. I met Sulari at She Kilda, which was right? It was about 6 or 7 years ago, and it was Sisters in Crime convention in Melbourne, and I was trying. I was new to the city, and I wanted to meet people, and I went. Turns out, I think I was the only male there, except for a couple panelists, and it was quite an intimidating environment. Male mystery writers were considered pale, male, and stale, so it was a little bit of a hostile environment for a single guy. But I went to a panel that Sulari was giving on the Sinclair mysteries. I hadn't read any of her books at the time. I'd seen them because I don't know if you know, the first editions of her books, she actually illustrated the covers herself. She's quite an accomplished artist, and I had seen the book at the Southern Cross station and not picked it up and looked at it, but I hadn't bought it or read it at that point. But I came out of that panel thinking, this woman is just brilliant. And I went up to her later, ran into her in the corridor in the vestibule, and we chatted. And I said, you know, if you ever want to set anything in the U.S. and you need somebody to talk to, I'll be happy to help you out. And that's how it all started.
And Lawrence, did you realize?
You didn't call me Larry. Yeah.
Larry, okay, yeah. So Larry, did you realize, at what point did you realize that Sulari was going to sort of loosely base one of her murderers on you? What was your reaction to that?
Oh, it was a great idea. I was concerned because she was working on one of the other books I was kind of consulting with her on. And I said, you know, hold off. She was so excited about this idea. And I had just sent her the pictures of the crime scene. And she called me back or texted me and said, Michael saw this and I have this greatest idea. And she was so taken by it that I was thinking, hey, you know, hold your horses. You got to finish this other book first. It was clear that she really had something going, and I don't know if I did keep you from doing it, but she was very excited by it, and it was a lot of fun for me as well. Of course, I didn't know exactly what was going on until she sent me the manuscript, and then that was when it was a little bit of a meta experience for me. And I think very, very early on, I could almost hear my voice, but just in the first letter or two. And I remember reading it, and very early on, she talked about heroic Chin wearing an uncollared shirt or a collared shirt and a jumper. And I read it, and I went, damn, I told her not to use jumper. You know, I mean, she should use sweater. And it hurt my feelings a little bit. I kept saying, no, you know, it's her book. She can choose to use jumper if she wants. Actually, the character writing it is an Australian, so she could use jumper. But I thought that was a pretty decent correction I gave her. And you know, it's her book, and I just had to just move on. And then 2 pages later, I read Leo telling her not to use jumper. And I'm like, oh my God. You know, and it was just wild. And then I realized what was going on.
Yeah. All right. Well, Larry, thanks for joining us. Stay on the line, Larry. We'll get to the audience Q&A. And if at any point, Larry, you want to chime in, please feel free. So first audience question goes to Joyce. What cooperation did you receive from the Boston Public Library directly or from the city of Boston generally? So Sulari, any cooperation from the Boston Public Library or the city of Boston?
No, they were not aware of what I was doing. For me, the representative of the Boston Public Library in the center, and the city of Boston was Larry, and so I had gone in there and look, and I was concerned also because I didn't want to. I felt like I was a literary guest in Boston, so I didn't want to do something that was going to offend Bostonites, and so Larry was my sounding board for that, having lived in Boston and gone to university there to actually check that up. So it was a surprise to the Boston Public Library.
And I guess the follow-up question would be, has anyone from the Boston Public Library reached out since you've published the book, and have they shared any reactions with you?
Not to me. I remember on reading a tweet where the librarians were reading it, but nobody. I don't think the part of the thing is when people reach out to me, they reach out to me under their names, and I don't think of them in terms of whether they're librarians at the Boston Public Library or not. So it's possible that one of the many people who've reached out to me was from the Boston Public Library. Certainly there have been people who say, I've been there all the time. There've been people who've been sending me pictures of my book in the reading room of the Boston Public Library. So a lot of that from readers, and I suppose I didn't ever ask them if they were there for a reason other than just visiting. So it could be that they were librarians, but I'd hate to say that without any evidence. Absolutely. But yeah, no, not that I'm aware. They may have reached out to my publishers or my publicist, but not directly to me. Uh,
I'm sure Larry would have caught this, but Linda in the chat just wants you to know, Sulari, that we are Bostonians, not Bostonites. So when you write your next book set in Boston, make sure you get that right.
I think it was correct in the book.
Yes.
It's just verbally I forgot, because we tend to, in Australia, we tend to say Melbourneites and Brisbaneites.
Yeah.
So I just flipped to that.
No worries.
But I think.
Yeah. Myra wants to dig a little deeper. So she writes, could Sulari please explain her writing process a little more? She stated that she knew the book had to start with a letter to Hannah, but then what? And as she sat down to write, what was she thinking?
Okay, so I have a really bizarre process. I write in a very relaxed way. I write in my pajamas, watching television. Now, the watching television part is what people find quite unusual, but there's a reason for that, and it was explained to me by a friend of mine who's a cognitive psychologist. So apparently the creative center of your brain is in your prefrontal cortex, so that bit at the front, and that part of your brain is very difficult to access directly. So that's why when you lose a word and you're trying to think of the word, you can't find it, but you go away and you do something else, suddenly the word pops into your head. Apparently, I'm using that process entirely for 90,000 words to write a novel. I'm distracting about 30% of my brain by watching television, so that I can write in a kind of a free-form way. So that basically is my process. I just sit there, I turn the television on, I start with the laptop, I start Dear Hannah, and I just go, what's the next sentence? So it was Dear Hannah, and then it seemed to me, what are you writing? And then from that sentence, what are you writing? I knew that whoever was writing to Hannah knew that she was a writer, because he wasn't asking, and knew that she would be writing, because he wasn't asking her, are you writing? He was saying, what are you writing? But they were close enough for him to question her on that. And then, so each sentence follows from the other and seems to organically build into a story. It sounds bizarre, but that's honestly the way I write. And then if I come to a point where I didn't know what to do, or I didn't know what to do next, I got in touch with Larry and said, look, I've started it at the Boston Public Library. Where would she live? I don't want to give her a car because that's too problematic to try and write a car into it. Where could she live? And so then Larry wrote back to me and he said, and I think initially he said, well, a writer couldn't afford to live in Back Bay. So he gave me another lot of options. But then I thought, no, I like the sounds of Back Bay. I'm going to give her a reason to live in Back Bay. And so it all just builds like that. It's, the research is done, or the question is asked at the time I need to know. And then the story is written from that point. I hope that explains it.
Sure. And that's a good observation by Larry. I don't think a writer could afford to live in Back Bay. We have another question, and maybe I glossed over this, I apologize, but just for dummies like me, Sulari, can you clearly define what metafiction is? Okay.
Metafiction is just writing about writing.
Yeah.
And you're not a dummy. I remember the first time when I wrote After She Wrote Him, and I sent the manuscript to my publisher in America. She said to me, oh, it's very postmodern. A metafiction was in the note that she sent back to me. And I had to Google postmodern and metafiction to find out what she thought I was writing. And that does correctly describe what it is. It's writing about writing. It's a story which basically shows you the gears and mechanics. So I like to think of it like one of those watches where you can see all the gears working. So this story shows you all those gears and all the mechanics of how the story is built, but hopefully it still tells you the time.
Teresa asks, would you like to see this book made into a movie or TV series? And if so, which actors would you want to see playing your main characters?
Oh, look, I'd love to see this made into a film, because I think I think it's, you know, structurally different enough and structurally difficult enough that it would be a really innovative film, and an interesting film. In terms of actors, oh, I don't know. They'd have to be handsome. The boys would have to be handsome.
Yes.
But I look, I have, I can see these characters in my head.
Mhm.
I know who they are. I don't necessarily pick actors to look like them. So it's very difficult for me to actually say, you know, this, it could be played by Johnny Depp or whatever, because not that Johnny Depp is right, but because I can see what the character looks like in my head. So it's very hard for me to match it up. It's the kind of thing that I would just leave to a casting director. They know what they're doing. And I've often thought of, you know, films and television as another art form based on yours. So it's a bit like a sculpture based on a painting. You'd never tell the sculptor what materials to use, even if he was basing it on your painting. So I think I'd let that go, and just hope that the end result was the best that it could be.
Myra says, excellent interview. Leanne says, no question, but I just wanted to say it's a phenomenal book. I picked some of her other books up and I've recommended them to lots of people. Victoria, I'm not going to read your comment in the chat because it's kind of spoilerish, but I 1,000,000% agree with what you just said. And I can't say enough that I loved the ending to the book. I was reading some of the reviews, Sulari. It was a little, some people, not so much, but I liked the ending and it caught me off guard, that's for sure. Let's see. So Teresa says, what is the best piece of writing advice you've received that you still use in your own writing today?
All right. And funnily enough, this piece of writing advice was not given as writing advice. It was given as law student advice. So it's when I was starting a new law student, an older law student once said to me, before you sit down to study, do everything else you could possibly want to do. If you want to go shopping, go shopping. If you want to go dancing, and only sit down to study once you've done everything else, and you won't be distracted. You won't be sitting there thinking, I wish I was doing something else. So I kind of follow that advice when I'm writing. If if it's a gorgeous day and I want to be in the garden digging flowers, I just go to the garden and dig flowers. And I don't let myself be caught up in this idea of I have to sit at the laptop and write. Because there's always, there's quality time writing, and there's the hours you just spend staring at the screen wishing you were doing something else. And if it feels like that, and it very rarely feels like that for me, because I love that time in front of the screen, just putting words together and making stories, what I love to do. But occasionally it'll be a particularly beautiful day and I want to be outside, or I want to be doing something with my dogs, or I want to be at a school event with my kids. I just do that. I just go and live that life, because everything that you gather in your ordinary life, everything, every feeling, every smell, every taste, every conversation you're part of, that's all material. So every second is part of being a writer, and nothing's wasted.
Marianne votes for Nicole Kidman for Hannah, and she really she loved the book, as did I. We'll get you out of here with two fun questions. An anonymous attendee wants to know the name of your dog that you mentioned.
My dog.
Yeah.
In the book, I don't think I mentioned dog in the book, but I have lots of dogs. I have 4 dogs. There's
one
Rolly.
behind you, I think, moving. So that's
yes. That's Miss Higgins. She's a Labradoodle. There's 2 behind me, and with her is Rolly. He's a cavoodle. I also have a a big hunt away who was a stray, and his name is Alfie. He came to us with that name, and I have a puppy who's in another room because she is not going to sit quietly while I Zoom, and her name is Pig, and she will be the truffle dog.
All right, so I'm going to ask you one more question, but before I ask the final question, let me do just one last pitch for Sulari's book. It's a US Today bestseller, Book Riot's 15 Best New Mystery Books of 2022, BookBub Most Anticipated Books of 2022, Pop Sugar's 25 Must-Read Thrillers and Mysteries of 2022, Goodreads Most Anticipated New Mystery, and it receives star reviews and Library Journal and Publishers Weekly, and it also gets Robert Hayes' stamp of approval as well. I did want to, though, ask you one question about your super popular series. Jill asks, is the new Roland book on the way? Sorry, I know this is for Woman in the Library, but we, Roland, Edna, and gang lovers are waiting.
It is on the way. It's you know, when it comes out is not just determined by me, it's determined by publishers' schedules, but it's certainly being written.
Jerry says Sulari is delightful, cannot wait to read the book. Michelle said, I love this program. Having the surprise guest was a bonus. Thank you, Larry. Thank you all so much. What a great evening to spend with such interesting insights. Jill says, thank you for the joy you bring to our lives in reading your books. Donnie says, excellent interview. Thank you. He has to rush out and buy the book. Teresa says, thank you, Sulari, great conversation. There's several other positive comments in the chat. The book is available on Kindle. It's available on audio. I listened to it on Audible. I will say this probably is a better book to read than listen to. I got a little confused at parts, but regardless, it's a wonderful book. It may be best if you actually read it ebook or in print rather than listen to it. So Sulari, any last words before we wrap it up?
No, thank you very much for having me. Can I just say to my American readers, thank you very much for embracing me. It's always a daunting thing to write into another country. You wonder whether, you know, the Americans are going to accept an Australian view of their city, and I've got nothing but help and warmth and welcome, and I am really very grateful.
Linda, who's a retired Boston Public Library research librarian, says thank you. And that you did a great job representing the city. So there we go. That answers one of our questions from before. Now you have been contacted by at least a former BPL employee. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Look for that email from me tomorrow with the feedback survey, the link to Wellesley Books, the link to this recording, and information about some other upcoming programs. I want to thank Sulari and all her people for making this possible. I want to thank Larry for jumping on the call. That was quite a pleasant surprise. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. Thanks again. And I hope for everyone here in America anyway, have a happy 4th of July. Thanks so much, Sulari.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.